Thank you, everybody. I'm glad so many came out. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Schmidt. He's on the faculty at Wright State University in the Department of Environmental and Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and is responsible managing their undergraduate program in this area. David has a BS and MS degree in geology from Wright State and a Ph.D. in geology from Ohio State. David is a local native. He grew up in Kettering and told me in his early email that he used to climb around and look for rocks and stuff, and now he does it for a living. And with no further ado, let me introduce Professor Schmidt. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here and to see what a wonderful attendance we have tonight. It's good to see that there's so many of you that are interested in the same kinds of stuff that I am. So thanks for coming out. So the title of my talk is Boulders, Bedrock, and Brewing Water, How Geology Has Influenced the History of Dayton and the Surrounding Area. So my objective for tonight is to describe the geology of the Dayton area, kind of give you a broad brush look at that, and then to discuss how local geology has influenced the history of the area, how it's affected the people and the places and the things that are in and around Dayton. And this has kind of a South Dayton theme to it. The first trained geologist to really look at the geology of this area was Dr. August Ph.D., who was a Dayton native. He did very important work on local fossils and local bedrock. He was nationally recognized, and he had lots of qualifications and opportunities to go work at prestigious institutions, but he decided to stay here in the Dayton area. He taught in downtown Dayton at the old Steele High School. He taught physics. That was his main vocation. And the reason he did that was he thought that teaching high school physics was the best way for him to do the research that he loved during the summer months without all the responsibilities of doing administrative stuff at a higher institution. And so he stayed here. He also had a sister who had been widowed at a young age, and he wanted to stay here and kind of help her raise her children. He wrote this wonderful book that was published almost exactly 100 years ago, An Introduction to the Geology of Dayton and the Vicinity. This is a great book. It has wonderful pictures of many of the features of this area from 100 years ago, and is still a very important resource for the glacial geology of the area. He did a lot of work on local bedrock, and this is a cross-sectional diagram from Mike Sandy at University of Dayton. He drafted this for the Centerville Historical Society, and it shows a cross-sectional view of local geology. This is like kind of a window into the ground showing you the major rock units here. So Dr. Ph.D. named these units. And I want to focus on three important formations tonight. A formation is a name that geologist gives to a rock unit that has characteristics that are unique enough that you can discern it in the field and separate it from rock units above and below. And these include the Drakes, the Brassfield, and the Dayton Formation. The Drakes Formation occurs locally. This is characteristic of the local bedrock from here down to the Cincinnati area. Has kind of that bluish-gray color. Interbedded limestone and shale. The shale weathers to the mud. So if you've ever gone collecting in the streams around here and you get kind of that bluish-gray mud caked on your boots and you track it into the house and your spouse yells at you, that's the shale component weathering to mud, and then the limestone or the hard, the ledge-forming units. And again, this is characteristic of the rock here. This is a shot from Cedar Creek showing you limestone being kind of the resistant ledge former, and the shale is what weathers out to the mud. So two different components really to this bedrock. The Drakes hasn't been used much economically in this area. It does. It has been used a little bit. Here's some structures near where I live in Oakwood. This beautiful house built out of Drake's Formation. This is over in the University of Dayton area and kind of a gateway to the Shantz Historic District in Oakwood. These were quarried nearby. There was also a pottery in the University of Dayton area that used clay from one of the small local quarries that stood there in Oakwood. But other than that, not a lot of economic use of this rock, although people come from all around the world to hunt fossils. Cedar Creek and some of these places are very popular among amateur and professional paleontologists. Overlying the Dayton is the Brassfield Formation. The Brassfield has been quarried extensively out in the Fairborn area for many, many years. It has just minor appearances in the Dayton area as leaving you hanging here, as kind of a building stone. And the reason for that is that it doesn't split into nice stackable slabs like preferable bedrock does. It just sort of fractures into these irregular masses like you see here. One notable exception is this Protestant chapel that's out on the VA Center grounds. I see people nodding, they recognize this. This is built right after the Civil War from some retired soldiers who quarried the rock there locally, and it still stands out there on the VA grounds. It has that kind of characteristic pinkish rust color of the Brassfield. It's a beautiful rock. It has a very distinctive composition and color, especially when it's wet. If you see this when it's wet, the colors and the textures just jump out at you. It's a beautiful unit. It crops out based almost in the backyard of where I work, up at Oaks Quarry Park near Fairborn. This is a public park. This was quarried up through the 1980s. Limestone used for Portland cement, an important component of concrete, so what was quarried there probably went into the roads and the highways and much of the buildings out at Wright Pat. This quarry eventually passed into the hands of the Oaks Development Corporation, who had some plans to develop the site until a man named Michael Horton, who was a veterinarian out in that area, said, how about instead of doing that, you donate it to the city of Fairborn and we'll turn it into a park. And so he somehow finagled that, and it's a wonderful place. It's a public park. It's a good place to go and stretch your eyes and kind of look around in an unusual environment and take your dogs and turn them loose. And it's a nice place not only for recreation, but at Wright State we do a fair amount of teaching, take field trips out there, do research out there, and so forth. Overlying the Brassfield is the Dayton Formation, and where this crops out is, or where it's been quarried, it's about 4 or 5 feet thick. In some of the earlier literature, it's referred to as the Dayton Marble, sometimes the Dayton Limestone. It's actually what geologists call a dolostone. It's an altered limestone, and the dolostones are very durable, and so it was good for engineering and architectural applications before concrete became widely available. So it was quarried extensively in the Dayton area and out in Springfield and many other areas for a building stone during the 1800s and on into about the World War I years. And so here's some examples of the Dayton Formation. You probably recognize the old courthouse in downtown Dayton. The gateway and chapel of Woodland Cemetery, much of the infrastructure of the canal is built out of this particular rock. And also if you go into the old neighborhoods like, a stone's throw from here, you see Dayton Formation used for curbstones and foundational stones and gate posts and fence posts and mile markers and tombstones and lots of other applications that you can think of that concrete would have later replaced. Here's some more examples of the Dayton in architecture in the Oakwood area, and if you see a foundation, a stone foundation in one of the buildings in the neighborhood here, it's probably Dayton Formation. This was quarried in a number of areas in the Dayton area. It was quarried behind this Lakewood Apartments along Wilmington Pike in Dayton. If you're not looking at an aerial photo, you may not know that there's a lake there. This was an early quarry. It was also quarried in the old Beavertown section of Kettering for a number of years back in the 1800s. This is the intersection of Dorothy Lane and Wilmington Pike. McDonald's stands right about there. I like to use food references. Many people, you know, it helps kind of, the light bulb goes on when they, oh yeah. And so where these arrows are pointing to are some quarry sites, and if you don't want to take my word for it, we'll go back to the 1930s and you can see exactly where some of these early quarries stood. They'd been abandoned by this time and filled up with water, but that was well before the old Beavertown neighborhood disappeared to the widening of Wilmington Pike. Dayton Formation shows up in a lot of sort of World War I. These early quarries were closed by about the turn of the century, by about the 1900s, whereas you see this Dayton Formation rock in a lot of homes that were built maybe World War I era. So the question is, well, where did all that rock come from? And to answer that, we have to turn our attention to Centerville. As you drive into Centerville, you see signs boasting that they have Ohio's largest collection of early stone buildings. And indeed, when you drive around in the downtown Centerville area, you see these early homes. Much of these came from several quarries in that area. The most prolific one being the Allen Quarry, which stood to the east of town, out across from, here it is. This is Centerville High School, Main Street here. Bill's Donuts, right around in here, you know. Another food reference. And if you're not looking at a map or an aerial photo of Centerville, you may not know that about 76 acres of downtown Centerville is actually underwater. This is where the Rod and Reel Fishing Club is now, kind of tucked away. This quarry was first worked back in the early 1800s. The stone coming out of there had an outstanding reputation among area builders who thought it was just about the best stone available for any purpose anywhere. This caught the attention in the 1880s of a man named Henry Lewis, who was a successful businessman living in the Cincinnati area. He was instrumental in the development of some of the street rail systems down there. He knew there was demand for stone in the Dayton area, that some of these early quarries were closing. Teaming stone is expensive, and he knew that narrow gauge railroad tracks ran through that area. So he teamed up with a man named Harold Talbot, who was a local civil engineer. He had a background in railroads before he came to Dayton. He built the first stone and concrete bridge over the Miami River in downtown Dayton on Main Street, had a hand in the locks at Sault Ste. Marie, president of the Dayton Wright Airplane Company, first mayor of Oakwood, Talbot family running me Playhouse, connection with here. He had his hand in a lot of different things. Lewis and Talbot formed a partnership and purchased the Allen Quarry and put a bunch of money into it, made some upgrades, and they built spurs connecting the quarry to the old narrow gauge rail line that ran through there at Centerville Station. They also organized about a half a dozen investors to purchase the rail line itself, and they established what was called the Dayton, Lebanon, and Cincinnati Railroad. This railroad ran from Lebanon up through some of these obsolete village names, skirted the eastern edge of Centerville, and eventually made its way into downtown Dayton. And so this gave the company a direct access to the stone yards that had stood since the canal days in downtown Dayton. So a lot of the stone went from the quarry to downtown Dayton, where it was kind of finished and then sent out to lots of areas from there. Well, this was profitable up through about the World War I years, until Indiana limestone, which is quarried over in south central Indiana, a much higher quality rock. They kind of got the distribution for that, and so Indiana limestone has been kind of the preferred limestone used in this area since about the 1920s or so, and that's gone into a lot of the higher quality buildings around here now. Well, after the bedrock was deposited in Ohio, the area was subjected to a long phase of weathering and erosion, which cut river systems into the bedrock. Prior to the ice ages, there was a mighty river called the Taze River, had its origins in the Carolinas, flowed across Ohio and over into the Mississippi to the west of here. Much different drainage than the Ohio. This all changed during the ice ages. Massive sheets of ice came down from the north, kind of rerouted everything. Earth cooled, snow fell, ice compressed, the ice started creeping under its own weight, kind of came and went from this area several times during the ice ages, and of course this influences the landscape tremendously. So this is kind of a Geology 101 textbook diagram showing you sort of the complex landforms associated with the toe of a glacier, depending on whether it's moving forward or melting back. So at their maximum extent, glaciers covered about the northwestern 2/3 of what's now Ohio. So overlying this eroded bedrock is this complexity of glacial sediments in kind of all sorts of complex patterns. Among them being end moraines, common in this area. End moraines are ridges of sediment that form as a glacier is advancing and sort of the toe melting back at the same time. And so this sheet of ice is moving forward, the sun's melting it back, and if you kind of train your eye on one of these particles, you see it's moving forward even though it looks like things are stationary. So this is a cross-sectional diagram showing you how these end moraines accumulate very long ridges of sediment that are common to the area. Common in western Ohio, in the northwestern part of the state. They trend kind of east-west, and then they got kind of hung up on when the glaciers hit the Bell Fountain area where the high ground is up there. Things got kind of wonky and the glacier split, and so the end moraines have very different geometries to the south of there. One of the features associated with glaciation is eskers. These are sort of snake-like ridges of sediment that are deposited under the ice. As the glacier is melting back, water can start flowing through the bottom, through nooks and crannies, forming ice caves. So here's a view of a modern ice cave branching in the upstream direction, and sediment. Glaciers are dirty, they're filled with sediment and rocks, and so this sediment will accumulate, the water will transport them into these ice caves, and then as the ice melts back, you're left with this system of this ridge system that branches in an upstream direction, basically. We had a pretty significant esker system here in this area. This is the area south of Calvary Cemetery and Carolyn Park to the west of Dixie Highway. Right here, if you kind of squint your eyes, you see this mighty ridge. Here's the end of it, and this is a picture from Dr. Fursty's book showing you this Pike Ridge right here. And there's some people up there for scale. You can see this was an enormous ridge of sediment, maybe 100 feet off the road. Beautiful, clean, washed sand and gravel, a wonderful natural resource. So this was about 100 years ago this picture was taken. If you're interested in a modern view of what this site looks like, it would be something like this. Right? Another site. And so that was a very attractive resource for sand and gravel, and that went into the concrete and the sidewalks and the building foundations. So here's a topographic map from 1955 showing that same area. And if you look closely, you see sand pit, sand pit, sand pit, sand pit, sand pit, sand pit. So lots of excavation of sand and gravel from that area during even back in the canal days, when the canal boats apparently would fill up here in the Carolyn Park area. The railroads would be getting sand and gravel. Later, just commercial sand and gravel pits, the material trucked away. So lots and lots and lots of sand and gravel excavated from there over the years. Well, you might imagine if ice sheets covering this area are presumed to be about a mile thick, maybe mile thick, and it's hard for me to get my mind wrapped around that. I go out and look up in the air, and I can't imagine that, but they were here, and you might imagine that something that big is going to issue an awful lot of meltwater as it melts back. So torrential flows of water would have occurred over this area when the glaciers melted back, and this established much of the modern drainage system here in Ohio. So the modern rivers have pretty much formed as a result of glacial meltwater. Dayton, of course, was settled at the confluence of the couple of these modern rivers, the Mad and the Great Miami Rivers, and Dayton was also settled on a floodplain. And when the first settlers arrived, the Indians, the local natives said, you might want to keep in mind that this area you're setting up your camp tends to, flood from time to time. And of course, Dayton had a number of floods during the 1800s, a big one in 1866, and of course the devastating one that affected Dayton and where we are in 1913. You probably know the story of Mr. Patterson, NCR leading the rescue and relief operations. He turned NCR into a headquarters where people were fed and were housed, and he was also instrumental in donating and raising money for the development of what eventually became the Miami Conservancy District, which of course built the dams and the other flood control measures in this area. Surface waters were not always just a menace. They brought the first settlers to this area from Miami. Thompson's party came up from Cincinnati in the late 1700s and settled in Dayton. Surface waters also provided for the power for the mills in this area. By the mid-1800s, there were several dozen mills along the Mad River and the Miami River and some of the secondary streams that flowed into them. And these surface waters also provided for the canal. The Miami and Erie Canal started in Cincinnati in the 1820s, made its way to Dayton in the early 1830s, eventually made its way up to Lake Erie, and this was quite the challenge. Here's a cross-sectional view showing you Cincinnati here, the high ground around Bell Fountain here, and Toledo up here. And so this canal had to cross-cut two totally different watersheds, everything flowing to the south of Bell Fountain into the Ohio River and everything to the north into Lake Erie. And so that required, of course, the system of locks and feeder streams and so forth, which was quite the engineering accomplishment of its time. Dayton also had 4 different hydraulic power districts that were important to the early economy. The way this worked is that water would be diverted from a stream into typically some ditch, a mill race, into a facility, would usually turn some sort of overshot water wheel like this, and then that would provide rotary power to the plant, and to that could be hooked up to the line shaft belts and pulleys to run sewing machines and drill presses and saws and whatever was needed, sewing machines in the facility for whatever use they had. And then the wastewater or the tailwater would come out a race and be sent back to the river. The most important of these was the Dayton, the upper hydraulic, which was dug and operated by the Dayton Hydraulic Company. It's a company that's actually still in business as a land holding and development company. And this consisted of a ditch dug from the Mad River up in this area into the northeastern section of downtown Dayton. Here's an early map showing you the mill race coming in here. There was a facility here, and most of the places that the rotary power were involved with were down here. And so there was a kind of a branch, a head race here, a tail race here, and so water would flow through these facilities, among them being an early version of the Mead Paper Company. Here's a little finer diagram showing you the water would come in the back, it would do its thing, and then go out into the front, into this side cut. And I believe they also not only had rotary power, but they had a turbine. And I think they generated a limited amount of electricity in that shop, too. These buildings still stand in the northeastern area of downtown Dayton. This is where the Mead Company was. You can see it's built into a hillside, and so the water would come in the back, gravity would do its work, and it was discharged. I believe it came out where these arched features are, and then there was the tail race out here, and the water would flow back into the canal. Well, Dayton Hydraulic Company was very successful. They charged reasonable rates. They had happy customers. They did a good business up until the early 1900s, when there was a decline in the demand for electric power due to electricity and coal and steam coming online. This left the Dayton Hydraulic Company with a lot of land, no customers for hydraulic power, but a lot of land in a long and narrow corridor that roughly paralleled Springfield Street in this area. This is looking to the southeast in the northeast part of Dayton. This is what a man named Frank Hill Smith, who was an Oakwood resident, had married into the family that had established this company. He took the helm of the company about that time. He had a background in the design and the construction of commercial and industrial buildings, and he developed their land holdings. So he was instrumental in changing the DHC from a provider of hydraulic power into a land holding and development company. So here's an early map showing you this mill race, and what he did was built a bunch of long and narrow buildings along it. So here's a modern look at that area, and you can see the route. He built these long and narrow warehouses and light industrial facilities. Dayton, here's an early map showing you the origins of the mill race along the Mad River. Mad River comes in from the east. It splits on either side of Rohrer's Island. And there was a low dam here. It's not shown on the map, but it kept the water high on the south side of the island. And then another low dam here kept the water high enough to flow into this ditch that was channeled into the northeastern area of downtown Dayton. This has been very cleverly repurposed by the city of Dayton, which has one of its major well fields now. These dams are still in place. The water's high on this side of the island, and there's an inlet where the water comes in, and they've dug a series of ponds here for recharging the well field that's there. So the water comes in through here. This is all very permeable sand and gravel. It flows into these ponds, and the city of Dayton has a bunch of wells sunk to 150 feet or so in this area. The water becomes purified as it works its way down through the sand and the gravel, and then there's a number of pumps at or below ground surface on the island that bring the water back up. They send it into a large diameter pipe that sends the water to another facility for pre-treatment, and eventually it's piped out to the city of Dayton and to the other municipalities in the area that buy its water from Dayton. This well field sits over the top of a much larger freshwater aquifer system that we have in this area. This is a cross-sectional view of kind of the downtown Dayton area, a window into the ground, if you will, and this is a few hundred feet deep, maybe about 6 miles wide, showing you the way this aquifer system is arranged. So this gray area is the local bedrock, and then all of this stuff in between is material resulting from deposition by glaciers, or more accurately, the meltwater coming off glaciers. So lots of sand and gravel deposited in this enormous ancient river channel. So the Miami River is right here. It's an itty bitty little puddle over the top of this enormous buried valley that's got a huge amount of fresh water just kind of slowly working its way through. So rainwater again falls down, becomes purified as it works its way down through the sand and gravel, and so it's a wonderful resource, flowing very slowly under our feet here. Contains an estimated 1.5 trillion gallons of nice, clean, fresh water, and was instrumental in Dayton's economic development. That's why we have so much industry here for so many years. Frigidaire, GM, related operations, National Cash Register. Here's just kind of a list of some of the facilities here, factories and businesses here that were kind of back during Dayton's industrial heyday, all taking water out of the ground to some extent, one extent or another. Among these, a little reconfiguration here. Among these was the Schmidt Brewing Company, which later became Riverside Breweries. This is a shot from showing the Miami River about in the area where the Dayton Art Institute is now. Right. This was taken down when the after the flood, and they decided to make some alterations to the river channel there. They took this down, unfortunately. But this was operated by Adam Shantz, a local brewer who consolidated some of the breweries in this area. He was a teetotaler, but ran these breweries, bottled and sold lily water. He had a patent for purifying just kind of tap water. He spattered it over these heated rocks and would cause the minerals to precipitate out. And he bottled it. He used it for brewing, and he bottled it and sold it way back before this became fashionable. So he had a great business. So Dayton has a very rich brewing history, and what's interesting is that Ohio has relaxed some of the laws pertaining to brewing now, and so we're seeing kind of a renaissance of microbrewers in this area. And so here's some of their wares and logos. So it's kind of nice to see these breweries coming back, and the groundwater in this area used again. Well, prior to the 1970s, of course, we had all this industry in the area. And this resulted in a drawdown of the aquifer. So this is some data from a monitoring well in the downtown Dayton area, showing you a drop of a few tens of feet of water underneath the city up until about 1970-ish. And at this time, there was lots of development in these low-lying areas along the river. Well, during the 1970s, a lot of the manufacturing facilities closed up and went bye-bye, and that meant that there was less water being taken out of the ground. And so since the 1970s, the water has come right back up to the level that it previously had been. And so this has caused a few problems in some of these low-lying areas. They're having problems with flooding in basements in some of the facilities near the Miami River, like here, the Montgomery County Administration Building. Here's some guys installing some drainage for trying to keep the building dry. I understand they have a meeting room in the basement of the facility that's almost unusable a lot of the time because it's just so wet there. Sinclair College, of course, has been battling water since year one. If you're at least as old as I am, you might remember when the library flooded. A water main broke there. It was a water main. It wasn't groundwater, but the water main broke. But this library is underneath the basement tunnel areas, and so there's no place for the water to go, and they had to very expensive. They had to pump it out. This guy is standing on a table, by the way, here. But Sinclair College continues to battle water. Here's a more recent photo. And if you walk around the campus there, you see these pumps. So they've installed drainage systems similar to the earlier picture of the administration building, where they've had to put in these pipes and drainage systems around the buildings, and then use pumps to draw the water away. And so if you walk along the bike path along the Miami River there, just to the edge of campus, you see a couple of these where this fresh water is just pouring out from the Sinclair area into the river as they try to keep the basements dry there. Same thing with University of Dayton Arena. built around 1970, 71 or so, right there next to the river, and the basketball court has flooded on several occasions here, and they keep having to upgrade their pumps and install more and stronger pumps to keep that facility dry. So depending on who you talk to, these guys might say, well, we almost have a little too much fresh water in this area, whereas a lot of places around the country are hurting for water. I'm sure you've heard the stories about Southern California, southwestern US, Las Vegas, Florida, sinkholes forming, swallowing up buildings, cars, people in Florida, development being limited in the Las Vegas area due to lack of groundwater ability, the very expensive desalination plant they just built out there in San Diego. Florida is having some problems with them taking too much water out of the ground before it can be recharged, and so salt water is coming in and contaminating some of their aquifers. So not enough fresh groundwater in many areas of the United States. Well, this of course has some economic implications. Manufacturers of prescription drugs, food, beverages, paper, electronics, and so forth all need large quantities of fresh water for their operations. So some of the business and political leaders in this area are catching on, the light bulb's gone on, and say, oh, well, let's try to draw some of that business here. So you land down at the local, at the Cox Airport, and you see these signs along the wall. Dayton, our cup runneth over. We have 1.5 trillion gallons of water here available. Come here and set up your business and employ our folks. Dayton Innovation Site, we have so much fresh water, we're spraying it up in the air for decorative purposes. The Dayton Development Coalition, Montgomery County, Ohio, is H2 open for business. Come here and set up shop, and if you put your water well where the colors are darkest on the map, you can pull 500 to 1,000 gallons of water per minute out of the ground with no slowdown in your well. So if this works out, and I hope it does, maybe we'll be seeing some of these types of water-intensive industries here in the Dayton area. We'll see. So, as enjoyable as it is and as important as it is to look at history, of course, it's also very important that we look ahead and we plan for our future, and maybe our water resources here will play a part of that. So it's in that spirit of also looking forward that I want to leave you with a couple quotes tonight. One comes from the great inventor Charles Kettering. He said, with respect to innovation, we must use the past as a guidepost and not as a hitching post. A more amusing take comes from the humorist P.J. O'Rourke, who said, for those of you who long for the good old days, I have 2 words for you. Modern dentistry. Thanks very much for your attention tonight. I'd be happy to take questions. Sure.
With all the sand and gravel we have here, what contributes to the amount of iron in the water?
That goes back to the days when the seas covered the area, and iron is just abundantly present in the Earth's crust, and so it was in the seawater, and it was of course in all the materials that the glaciers brought down too. So
Go back to the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. And so it's just the fact that it's so abundant in marine water and in the Earth's crust that it's just everywhere.
So those wells are in limestone and they're not in this buried aquifer. These iron wells that give iron that he's talking about are not into this aquifer, right?
The well field that I showed you, that's all.
The wells that he's talking about that deliver water with lots of iron.
Oh, I see.
Are not in this
right.
aquifer. They're out in the limestone areas.
Correct. Yeah, many wells are actually down in the in the bedrock too, and so you get concentrated, and there's lots of iron. It's limestone, but it's kind of dirty limestone, and you'll see iron staining. Lots of pyrite in the local bedrock, and I think probably a lot of the iron that's coming in, that's in the water, and mucks up my in-law's filters that he has to change all the time from his well is coming from the pyrite in the local limestone. Yes, sir.
Can you explain the concept of the Miami Valley? What does that mean?
I think
when
it's
you say
kind of
Miami
a
Valley, what does that mean?
it's
What's the question?
I mean geologically.
so the question is explaining what geologically the Miami
Yeah,
Valley.
I mean, what is the valley? Is it the river? Is it the aquifer? What is composing? Is it a misnomer? What is
Well, the diagram that I showed you earlier of the Taze River is kind of the origins of the Miami Valley. And so there was an ancient tributary of the Taze called the Hamilton River that flows in basically the same route that the modern Miami Valley, the Miami River flows, and that was kind of what was represented in that cross-sectional diagram that I had of the aquifer. So I think it's kind of an informal term to describe that wide, 6-mile-ish wide swath valley that the modern day Miami River is flowing through, and perhaps some of the upstream tributaries.
That's the area that filled up with all of the glacial till, in other words, to form the aquifer.
Yes, it hasn't filled in completely, but there's still this valley. If you're coming into the Dayton area from westbound 75, and you sort of hit the Enon area, you go down a big hill, and I think you're on the edge of the valley there, and then you look way out in the West Dayton area toward the VA Center, you see it going back up again. That's about 6 miles, and that's what I would consider to be the Miami Valley in this area.
And was there at some point a 6-mile wide river flowing there?
It was, I don't know that it was that wide, but it certainly cut down this enormous valley. I think if we didn't have all the glacial material over the top of it, we would probably have some pretty spectacular national parks in this area. Yeah, so a narrower river cut down into that. Way in the back.
Me?
Yes.
Any thoughts on the later bedrock formations like the Mississippi and Pennsylvania and Permian? What happened to them here?
Great question.
Were they ever there?
Yeah, I get students ask me, when I was a student at Ohio State, I went to the most venerated faculty that we had in our department and said, what, were the dinosaurs here? What's happened to all that? And it's like, we don't know. It's all gone. And so I think in some cases, it's hard. I don't know that anybody's really got a handle on how much of those missing units have to do with non-deposition and how much of it has to do with post-depositional erosion that occurred after the seas went away and during glaciation. I think that I personally don't think that we had Mississippian seas covering this area and some of those younger units. I think a lot of it is just simply that the seas receded and didn't deposit that material here as it did in other areas. But boy, there's an awful lot of work that could still be done on that. It's very interesting to contemplate what happened between the time the seas covered this area and what happened during when the glaciers came in. Just a big missing piece of the puzzle that there's hardly any evidence for it, but I sort of have hopes that one of these days somebody's going to be crawling around in a cave somewhere and something that didn't get washed away by the glacial meltwater will be there, and who knows. Sir.
Was the city of Moraine named as a reference to the tip of the glacier that came down as far?
There are no moraines in moraine. It's actually a misnomer because there are these. Geologists like to split hairs over the names of features that other people are happy to use in less formal ways. But moraines refer to the fact refer to material deposited directly by ice, like these end moraines, whereas kames and eskers are features deposited by meltwater coming off of the ice. And so aside from what's called ground moraine, which is the flat-lying material deposited when ice sheets are either rapidly moving forward or backward, there's really no moraines in moraine resulting from direct deposition by ice. And so I think whoever named it just named it for the fact that there are, we have an unusual amount of landforms in that area related to glaciation, and it's fair enough to call it moraine, but it was just named from the fact that during these several comings and goings of ice sheets in this area, we have this complex array of landforms deposited in the area.
Thank you.
You bet. Way back here.
Is the aquifer a trapped body of water, or is it actually flowing somewhere?
It's actually very gradually, very slowly flowing underneath our feet, and so I think kind of the headwaters in this area is up in the Bell Fountain area. Rain falls and it kind of drains in this direction very slowly and gets channeled into the aquifer. So most of what's here is moving very slowly, although there are some pockets here and there of water that is stagnant. And I heard a story of, I think out in the Springfield area once, somebody decided to, they were doing a fish farm or some kind of aquaculture, and they pumped a bunch of water up from the subsurface into a pond, and they stocked it with fish, and all the fish died. Found them floating at the top because the water wasn't oxygenated. It hadn't been moving. It had just been kind of sitting there for a long time, and they had to rethink their plans. Next here, yeah.
Yeah, on the concerning the aquifer, what are the mineral characteristics of the water, and does it differ at different places where you would sink a well? Is it rich in certain minerals, or?
It's mostly dissolved limestone, and so anybody who's got a home, they probably they all have a water softener, and the poor folks that are downwind of all this water being sprayed up in downtown Dayton area come out and they find their car windshield is covered with a nice thin layer of lime after they get off work. So it's an awful lot of dissolved calcium carbonate, dissolved calcite from the bedrock here, as well as iron and a few other trace minerals, but mostly just dissolved calcium carbonate.
Does that differ from different places you would sink a well, like say further south or around here?
Probably not significantly if it's going into the bedrock, because the sea was pretty much uniform as when the bedrock was deposited, but of course the glacial sediments in this area can vary considerably depending on the timing and the source rock, and so there's different anomalous pockets of materials in the glacial sediments. There's little concentrations of gold in some portions of Ohio, and people are always very secretive about where those are, but there is some anomalous distribution of minerals resulting from glaciation.
Thank you.
Sure. Sir.
Yeah, you had a display, a graphic up there about water depletion and replacement.
Yes.
The far right edge, I don't think that was part of your chart because it suddenly went all the way up to the ceiling, let's say. Well, did that refer to anything, or is that just the edge of your chart?
I think it was just the edge of the chart. The data went up through 2004 or something, and it just kind of ended there. The point is that the aquifer has kind of come back to its original levels and just kind of maintained the about the same height, if that answers your question. Yes?
How slow is the movement of the water in the aquifer?
Boy, Great question. It's certainly slower than the river is flowing, but I actually don't have a good handle on how fast it's moving through the subsurface. I suspect it varies with depth and the porosity and the permeability of whatever materials it's going through. Some material is more confined than others, but I guess I don't have a good answer to like an average rate for you.
But it's of the order of like a meter a day, isn't it?
I would guess that's kind of in the ballpark, yeah, but that's just a guess. Maybe some hydro people here could give us a better example. Sir?
Where is the outflow of that? Does that get down to the Mississippi River?
The aquifer, I think it eventually is going to head its way pretty much into the Ohio and eventually wind up in the Mississippi. I think it kind of ends up in the southwestern part of the state.
Very good.
Kind of Cincinnati area.
Sort of similar question. As the Miamis flow into the Ohio, how come they didn't go any further south? Was the Ohio an existing river that flowed to the southwest, or did it, because the glaciers ended up 50 to 100 miles, but they went further to the east also, right?
Right.
So when you talk about the Ohio flowing down in North Bend and come up, and then it flows to the southwest all the way to the Mississippi pretty much.
Right.
But, the Ohio comes in at the Great Miami comes in right near North Bend, near the upper end.
Yeah.
So is there a reason that it was just higher formation, bedrock, further south? Do you know?
Well, again, the Miami has its, if we go back to the Taze River, that big ancestral Ohio river, the Miami flows over one of its tributary valleys that flowed into the Taze. During the ice ages, all the ice and the logs and the debris that came down into this area basically dammed the flow of the Taze. It created a large lake. There was an enormous lake for a few thousand years in southeastern Ohio called Lake Tite. It filled as a result of this ice dam, and then eventually it breached its banks somewhere, and then it all rushed out, and that is what created the Ohio. And so it just kind of coincides that the route it took is where
So it followed, and that large amount of water would flowed for a long time, I would assume. Big lake, like it did in Washington State.
Mhm.
Like there when it down the Yakima River or the other rivers that flowed, Columbia River was the same sort of thing. When there was super waterfall.
I think that's roughly analogous. Yeah, to what happened here. Sir?
You mentioned topographical maps. Who would have now in Montgomery County? Would it be the Miami Valley Conservancy District, or where would be the main source for the flow of the aquifer to actually see a map of it?
Oh, a map of kind of the flow, the subsurface flow pattern? Wow, that's a great question. I would probably start with an inquiry to the Conservancy District.
Does Wright State do something themselves, or do they get their information?
We do an awful lot with water-related research, mostly having to do with water contamination types of issues. I don't know that we have ever been involved with any large-scale mapping of the flow of the groundwater routes. I think that's probably been addressed in piecemeal in master's theses, but I don't know that anybody's ever tied it together. But I wouldn't swear to it.
Thank you.
Sure. Speaking of topo maps, I'm sorry, the historic.
I think NCT does have a book on that.
Oh.
They have, they published something that's probably like 20, 30 pages long that shows you the aquifer by depth in great detail.
Okay.
I've seen it a couple times.
There's a wonderful paper that was done in the 1960s. Norris and Spiker, I believe, were the authors, and that's been kind of the Bible for local groundwater studies for an awful long time. A very lengthy paper, and it's possible that that may have some good material in it too. Yes, sir.
Can you speak to the existence of natural lakes in the state of Ohio? Are there any? Natural lakes, or are they man-made?
Well, unless they've got a dam on them, like Cedar Creek and Cowan Lake and
Right.
some of these facilities that the Army Corps of Engineers have been involved with. There's certainly no scarcity of natural lakes that have formed in the low-lying areas. If that answers your question.
A dammed up stream is not a natural lake.
Right.
So the answer to the question is, no, there are zero. My understanding is there are zero natural, made by Mother Nature lakes in this state.
That's what I'm
They were made for, dug for water for the canal, like Lake St. Mary's.
Well, there's artificial lakes, yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Well,
right.
that's
A
what
number
they're-
of canal
that's what
feeder
they're at.
lakes, as well as dam facilities, but certainly, if I understand the question, of course we have the Great Lakes, once you get into northern Ohio, a number of, especially in northern Ohio, a number of natural lakes. But
If there were shallow lakes, do they become bogs because dirt and things would flow, the glacier would be there? Because, there's Cedar Bog up by Springfield. Would that have been a lake, at one time?
probably, and
That's
it's
not a
gotten
bog.
kind of silted up over.
Fen. The
Yeah.
fen is flowing from the upper, it's not a bog. Bog is a bowl.
Right. Miss?
During the heyday of the industrial time, when all of these companies drew from the aquifer and the aquifer dropped,
Yes.
what was above the aquifer then? Is the
Uh,
aquifer actually just water, or
The
is it
aquifer
containing material?
It was, so the aquifer is in permeable sand, gravel, pretty much above the bedrock.
So it
And
became
so
drier.
And so, yeah, we would have had porous material, but dry.
And then as the aquifer has gotten higher,
Mm-hmm.
does some of it form pools, lakes, bogs?
I don't know of any significant features like that because it's, I'm unaware of any. The aquifer is kind of what I was speaking of, the Great Miami Buried Valley Aquifer is kind of confined to that swath of the Miami River, and I don't know of any major features like that have formed again. There's probably to some extent some kind of soupy grounds that have come back that had been there before.
In a sense, right here in Miamisburg, the hills are very close on this side, we're mounded.
Yes.
It's not even a mile across till you're on the west shore of Miami, which is solid, which seems to be solid rock. So the river compressed here, the Miami River very narrow here, because I don't think there's a deposit on to the west. If you go just across the Miami River, you go up steeply like you do on the west side of Dayton. And it's not very far across till you get where we are, just to the, a few hundred yards.
Yeah, you're kind of in the bedrock here,
Yeah,
from what I know, and so the river probably, this may have been it was probably cut into the bedrock over here, and then a kind of during those early days a steep, much steeper bank over here, and a much more gradual slope to the west.
Because if you go south toward Franklin and Middletown, it's much broader base.
Yeah.
The river turns to the west and
Yeah.
has several miles across, like it did in Dayton.
Mm-hmm.
here, pretty narrow.
Yeah, yeah, it's unusual. It's kind of anomalous for a path along the river to have this bedrock so close to the modern day river. Great fossil hunting area up there too, by the way. I had a student bring in a bunch of nice fossils that he gathered from up here not too long ago. Sir?
I have a less technical question. I think I understood you to say in some of your opening slides, it was Dr. Christie who named the Drakes and Brassfield formations?
Yes.
Do you know why he named them that? Was he commemorating some revered professor or?
Bedrock units are typically named for geographic areas in which they're sort of identified or first studied. And so the Brassfield, for example, was named for a small town in Kentucky that was along one of the railroads, and there was a railroad cut that he studied down there where he first said, okay, this is the features of the Brassfield. It has this color and fossil content and so forth. And I'm unfamiliar with the Drakes where that name came from, but that's kind of the standard in naming sedimentary rock units, is to name them for a municipality or locale by where they crop out and are first studied, and they have all the typical characteristics of that unit. All right.